Welcome, everyone. Today is Monday, and I'm so glad to have you here. It's right after Easter, so I hope everyone had a wonderful holiday weekend wherever you are and wherever your families are. I'm so glad to be here with you. We're having a Friday Forum on Monday because we have some very special guests. So as you're coming into the Friday Forum today, go ahead and put in the chat your name and your location so that Kathy and Ron and Leanne and I will see who you are and where you're from. And also get, you'll be able to, my guests will be able to see the wide variety of audience that I have. It is my special and very honor to be able to welcome both Cathy Finks from the College of Wooster and Ron Lieber from the New York Times to join with us today to talk about a subject that's very important to us. This is my role, is to invite subject matter experts to talk about things that are important to us as we work with families and students. So welcome, Cathy, welcome, Ron, and of course, Leanne, glad to have you here. She's gonna help me manage and respond to your text and emails. So today is an opportunity. We're almost at the end of college admissions season. So we're still, students are still deciding which colleges they're going to go to and what kind of financial aid. So we're all very much interested in the topic of today of merit scholarships and looking under the covers and seeing what that means. So I'm very proud and honored to have Cathy, you here with me. You are the executive, I want to get this right, the executive director of admissions at the College of Wooster. So can you tell us a little bit about your position and what what you do there?
Sure. Well, thank you for having me, Cyndy, and it's great to have Ron with us as well. I'm very excited to hear what he's going to share. The executive director or dean of admissions at any liberal arts school is a jack of all trades, right? So you're doing everything from, of course, building a class of diverse and interesting students with their talents to Wooster, but you're doing marketing to build from, or to borrow from Ron's language in his world. We're also the profit center, right? The primary profit center for the College of Wooster. So putting on that finance hat. And then, of course, putting my job on the line to read the minds of 18-year-olds and see what they want. So a little bit of everything, here as a dean.
And Ron, what about you? We're so honored to have you here. You're a New York Times reporter. You're an author. I'm sure you have many other things that myself and many other people are not aware of. So share a little bit about yourself, what you're involved in, and your current position.
Sure. So I write the Your Money column for the New York Times. I'm the author of a book called The Price You Pay for College that came out a little bit more than a year ago. And you
mean this book right here, right?
Thank you. Yeah. And
so if you guys haven't gotten this yet, look at that.
So first of all, thank you for having me. And also, thanks for coming. I see 93 here. That's just spectacular. And I just want to give you all a shout out because people like me notice that for any number of reasons that, we don't need to talk about today and about which, some of which I should probably hold my tongue, the counselors in public schools for reasons that are understandable, and the counselors in private schools for reasons that are not really understandable and are sometimes inexcusable. And I see the results of this time of year, and you probably do too. They're not paying enough attention to how merit aid works. And sometimes it's because they can't. Sometimes it's because they don't want to for any number of reasons. And sometimes, maybe more often than sometimes, it's because it's just too darn complicated. And so the fact that more and more of you are trying to create value in this particular space with what you do and the advice you offer, particularly on the front end, is just a blessing as far as I'm concerned. Because 6-7 years ago, when I first started thinking about a book somewhere around the paying for college space, I could count on one hand the number of independent educational consultants that I could find that were merit aid specialists and merit aid smart. And I know that's changing. I'm thrilled that it's changing. I wish that you could get your associations to make it easier for families to find those of you who are really good at this. Please tell them I said so. So, I write about everything under the sun that hits you in the wallet, with a special focus on the areas where feelings and finance overlap. I find that to be, the stuff where the highest amount of money is involved, just because that, generates all sorts of feelings. And then also stuff that kind of intimately involves our family. And, when we're talking about children, it's all just like a sort of heady mix. And part of the reason I decided to go down this road was because I felt like a lot of parents were making questionable choices because they were being impacted, understandably, by emotions like fear and guilt and snobbery.
I love that. Fear and guilt and snobbery. We've talked more about in the past about how going to college is almost a rite of passage, right? And so what prompted you to do the research and actually further go into that? You were looking for merits, people who had that expertise, but so what was your motivation for doing that?
Sure. So the reason I think I ended up writing about personal finance in the first place, sort of writ large, has to do with my own personal experience of running the financial aid gauntlet. So I graduated from Francis Parker School in Chicago in 1989. Karen, I see you out there in the Chicagoland area. I don't know if you deal with any Parker kids. I'm still a self-identified Parker kid. So, my family had kind of a crack up midway through. And my parents got divorced. My dad lost his job. There was a couple of years where, we didn't have a whole lot of income to speak of. The Parker community kind of wrapped their arms around us, put us all on scholarship, essentially for the rest of our time there. As you might have guessed, and if you're old enough to remember, you'll probably be laughing. The idea of a college counselor at a private school knowing how to advise somebody on navigating the financial aid system, in the late 80s was kind of a laughable notion back then. I think there was a single-digit percentage of kids on financial aid at Parker back then. But John McClintock, who was the counselor at Parker at the time, had the name of this guy to go see if you needed this kind of help. And it turned out that the assistant director of financial aid at Northwestern University at the time had this side hustle going where you'd go in and pay him $50 in cash and he'd explain all the secrets of the financial aid system. And this guy knew exactly what he was talking about. I got into Amherst early decision. I got a fantastic financial aid package. And I learned a couple things, right? First of all, that I was really grateful to my mom for, bringing me along for that appointment so I could really see how things worked. But also to this guy who was probably breaking all sorts of ethical rules and could have and maybe should have gotten fired for what he was doing. It turns out that there are grown-ups all over the place who know exactly how to crack the code on any given system, and you just have to find them, right? So it's probably not a big surprise that I grew up to write about personal finance. Had my first kid in 2005 when I was at the Wall Street Journal, started writing about saving for college and how problematic 529 plans were at the time. Thankfully, those of us who were pounding the table and everybody out in the industry kind of solved for that. They're much better than they used to be. I pivoted when I got to the Times to writing about paying for college, how to pay for college, the right way, the wrong way. That was the first time we were seeing undergrads, wash out of, 4 years of school with six-figure debts and no co-signers, kind of in hock to Citibank. A lot of that's gone away with mandatory co-signing, but the federal loan program is still, an administrative shambles, which I've written about for years. But when I started to age into the cohort where the early breeders among my friends were sending their first kid to college, I started to get all these calls. And they're like, you're mouthing off all the time in the newspaper on the weekend, about the loans and about the savings. but I'm sitting here, with 3 offers for my kid, and she can go to Champaign for 100 grand. She can go up to Lawrence University with this nice merit aid package. I don't even know what that means. My counselor didn't tell me anything about merit aid, right? She can go do that for 175 or 200. And then she, shot the lights out and got into Carleton, right? But that's going to be $300,000. We earn $250,000 a year. We don't qualify for any need-based aid, but we can actually, go around writing $75,000 checks to the, overlords in Northfield, Minnesota. So where is all of your fancy journalism about why Lawrence is 100 grand better than Champaign-Urbana and Carleton College is $200,000 better than Champaign? And I had no idea what the answer to that question was. Nobody had ever asked it that way, and people just kept asking. Right? And they want to know where the data was, right, that proved this. And I thought, wow, I've been failing my readers in this respect, right? Because for all of the ink that I'd spilled over how to save and how to pay, I missed the most important question of all, which was what to pay for college. It was a value question. It was a values question. There was no way I was going to answer it in 5 or 10 or 20 newspaper columns. And that's when I decided to write the book.
Wow. So what surprised you when you started digging into this and started learning what merit scholarship was? What surprised you in that research as you started doing that?
Well, I sort of poked away, for a year or 2 or 3 before I really settled in to report on it full time and take a lead from the newspaper. So, every couple months I'd stumble into something else that kind of blew my mind. None of it feels surprising anymore because I've been wallowing in it for a while. So I guess I would answer that question in a different way, which is, what are the things that still surprise otherwise smart, successful in their own professional fields parents who are approaching this for the first time? They're surprised that in the background, there are all of these algorithms, whirring and spinning that are controlled by consulting firms made up of PhDs, trying to figure out, exactly what people are able and willing to pay and the difference between ability and willingness by sucking up dozens and dozens of pieces of information. I'll never forget the first time one of the consulting firms let me under the hood and they showed me their master database of every high school of note in the country. And they were all ranked like to the, 10th decibel place. And they had 50 or 60 fields about the schools and which kids went where and did they persist and, what was their GPA and the average ACT score and, the zip code +4 income predictors they were using from, the credit bureaus. And I tell parents about this stuff and, their mouth drops open. But this really shouldn't be any surprise, right? This is a multi-zillion dollar industry here, right? Where there's $350,000 on the line per family at the rack rate. And so, of course, there's going to be sophisticated pricing mechanisms going on. And when you explain it to people that way, they understand, right? But I think it takes them a while to understand that they're sort of entering into a sophisticated sales machine, right? And that's not a pejorative, right? We want there to be hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of choices for our children. We want all these schools to survive, right? But they're competing with one another in a real marketplace. And you have to know that before you can begin to try and work within the system.
That's very true. And I think that you bring up a really good point is that, and I know as an instructor for UCLA, oftentimes we look at this admissions as from a very simplistic, either you get admitted or you're not, either you're worthy or you're not. And it's not that simple at all. So Cathy, how, from the college perspective, how do you explain merit scholarships and, what that perspective is? And I mean, you face this with families all the time too. So how do you handle that perspective?
Yeah. So, the simple answer is that we talk about using merit scholarships to attract students and reward them for what they they've done and what they will contribute to the college, regardless of need levels. That's kind of the simplistic answer. But what Ron is trying to dig into is that, what we're really doing is using our dollars wisely with the competition that we have in our backyard. And so not every family is willing to pay full freight. And so even in the examples that he just gave between Carleton and Lawrence, how do you get a family to look at the investment of you early enough in the process, early enough in the funnel, if you will, before they make those decisions about where they're going, which also gets back to that value piece that Ron was describing and that he put in his book. What are those things that are worth paying for? And so it's a kind of easy answer off the tongue, right? Where Mary is really rewarding students for who they are and what they've done, regardless of their need. But it's the behind the scenes that can get really complicated. But we're trying to really showcase the investment that we're going to put into their education with our own dollars, and how that can allow them to make that choice to be at Wooster and to really contribute.
That makes sense. Now, Ron, in your book, you highlighted some of the questions that people should be asking as they go through this process. And that's why Wooster ended up with, a highlight, an actual chapter in the book. So what are some of those things that you identified as you said, that return on the investment? What makes Lawrence or Wooster or things like that, more valuable investment for families?
Sure. So, let me start quickly with the basic framework. I can't remember exactly when this occurred to me or how, but as I lapped the country talking to as many families as I could, I was trying to ask them like basic, what sounded like existential, but, non-rhetorical questions, which are things like, what is college, right? Like, what is the point of the exercise here? What is the definition of success here, and how much is enough? And eventually, after a lot of kind of puzzled looks and probing, people would eventually say one of three things, both the students and the kids, right? You go to college for the learning, right? To have your mind sort of blown up and reassembled into a better version of itself by, experts of all sorts and your peers, right? So you go to college to learn. You go to college to meet your people, right? The friends who will pick you up and carry you through life forever. And the grown-ups, the mentors, the professors, the clergy, the deans. I'm still buddies with the director of financial aid from Amherst, now retired, 35 years later. He's actually an ordained minister. We refer to him in our household as Saint Joe Paul Case, because that's literally what he was to our family. So, you go to find the people who you never could have imagined existing in the world, and that you might never have met otherwise, or at least not in the same way. So that's number two. You go to college for the kinship. And number three, you go for the credential, right? And maybe it's the thing that, kind of takes you out of poverty, working class, unstable middle class existence and kind of cements you, on a spot on the socioeconomic class ladder that's higher than, your family was before. Or maybe you're trying to throw open the doors to rooms and buildings and worlds that you would not have gotten into without the fancy name or the brand that means something in a particular industry or to a particular gatekeeper. So learning, kinship, credential. So it sort of started there. Now, as far as Wooster goes, one of those. So I began the process thinking to myself, okay, you got to get out of your New York Times, all the readers are obsessed with the Ivy League world, right? So I knew that. And I knew I wanted to focus on the place in the marketplace where, right, people have the willingness to pay, they have the ability to pay whatever they can pay. And sometimes there's a gulf between that. And in that gulf, is somewhere between 50 and 100 schools that are trying each year to figure out how to use pricing and discounting to kind of bridge ability to pay and willingness to pay while keeping the lights on and, putting the right number of heads in beds. So, Wooster was on that long list. And so, I was trying in part to go to places I'd never been before, to go to places New York Times readers may have never been before, and places that were not on either coast, just because that's where a lot of our readers were, right? I wanted to make sure the book was kind of was literate, I guess, in all sorts of schools for all sorts of people, even though I thought a lot of the buyers would be coastal, right? So how do I get to Wooster from there? Well, I was looking, among those 50 or 100 schools, it's really hard to stand out, right? I mean, you can be USC or Tulane or Northeastern and use the comeback of cities as your bridge to getting ever more students and using pricing and honors programs as a way to reel people in. Like, those schools have been fabulously successful using those strategies. But what about the small liberal arts colleges that are, trying hard to persuade people of their worth, right? I come from one, so, I have a bias towards those, right? What about the ones in the middle of the country? I come from the middle of the country, right? I want my kid to go to college in the middle of the country, the 16-year-old. I don't know how she is going to feel about that, but I'm working on her. Right. So, those were my biases. And then there were a couple of things happening at Wooster that really made it stand out. First of all, was this, the IS, what most people know of as senior thesis. It's mandatory there. It's only mandatory at a, tiny handful of schools. Princeton is the, sort of most prominent. And I just thought both that it was really neat that everybody did there, that it gave you the kind of one-on-one learning with a potential mentor, with a real faculty member, like non-graduate student, like the kind that I would have learned from at the University of Illinois. And then there's this annual sort of Woodstock there every year where everybody presents at the end of April. Everybody, gives some live version of what it is they've learned or done and created. And I went 3 or 4 years ago, and I mean, I had a lot of great tingles at a lot of campuses when I was doing this reporting, but being there, it just sort of made me feel like, wow, right? I think a lot of parents would dig this if their kid cares about the learning. Now, there are lots of people who go to college and don't really intend to learn anything, and I have no value judgment about that. There are good examples of that. So anyway, I like Wooster for that reason. The other reason is that I'm just sort of a nut job about transparency. And the more reporting I did, the madder I got about the lack of predictability for merit aid in particular. And, Wooster a bunch of years ago just decided, well, we're going to dispense with all that. And we're just going to tell people ahead of time what they're going to get if they get in. Seems simple, right? Well, nobody else does it, with the exception of Whitman and, out in Walla Walla, Washington, and 1 or 2 other schools. But the fact that Wooster was doing this, I thought, was just a useful reminder for parents that it can actually work this way. Pricing doesn't have to be a mystery, right? You should feel empowered to ask questions. And you should feel empowered to go to, schools that are sort of rough peers of Wooster and say, why the hell can't you do this too? Right? What's your problem? Right? Particularly after you get, and I know that people don't want to do that ahead of time. Right? So it was it was interesting to me, for that reason. So, that's why I spent time there than I did. And, it's not because I feel like Wooster is the right place for everybody. I mean, I heard a couple of weeks ago from a kid who went to Wooster after having seen it in my book and is now transferring out, I think, after 1 year. Where they said, it's not your fault, right? I just didn't know. I didn't really get like what it was going to be like to be in that town or in that part of the world, right? So that's fine. So it's not going to be the right place for all sorts of kids. But I was trying to give people a sort of template for interrogating the process and interrogating the product, right? And if you do that in exactly the right way, in the way that I outlined for people, 6% of you will end up applying to Wooster. And, 11% will end up applying to the University of New Mexico, right? And then like a bunch of others will want to be in the Clemson honors program, right? And I don't care, right? I just want you to ask the right questions.
I think that really does highlight the challenges that we have as parents, students, and counselors. College has gotten to be, if not the most expensive investment families can make. And many people are spending more in college than they do on their houses. It's way more expensive than a car. And yet we never ask somebody to pay for a car without knowing exactly how much it's going to cost. And it always amazes me that we expect families to close their eyes, hold out their hand and say, yeah, tell me, admit me, and then tell me how much I'm going to make after I've made all these decisions. I have a local university that does that regularly. Oh, the financial aid offers might come out mid or end of April. Well, students have to tell you by May 1. So, we're behind. Like, that's not very helpful, for families having to make those decisions. So, so that's a key thing. So Cathy, what about, talking more about this, the financial aid early read, and evidently Wooster's been doing this. Sounds like you started the trend on this. So explain a little bit more about what that means.
Yeah, we're kind of happy to be on the forefront of the financial aid transparency, or financial transparency for colleges. We've started 10 years ago, at least, of doing what we call an early aid estimator. The net price calculator is out there, and it's there's other formulas that even Ron talks about in his books, where you can plug in a GPA and a test score or some other formula, and you can get a graph that kind of shows you what your merit aid might be. But for for selective colleges, we do more than just put in two numbers, right? We really look for those fits and reward them based on that. And so it's not as easy as just putting two numbers in. And so again, over a decade ago, we said, okay, if people are looking for that emotional, academic, social fit, how do we help them find that financial fit as well? And how do you help them find it early enough in the process? And so we have something that's called an early aid estimator, where students, before they even apply, so in June, July, August, September, October, November, they can do either or both parts. The first part is what I would call a mini application. And the second part would be a mini FAFSA, or a mini financial aid document. And if they submit those pieces, one or the other, we will say, okay, if you're admitted, here's what you'd get in terms of an estimate for merit scholarship, and here's what you would get in terms of an overall financial aid package, kind of layering the two on top of each other. It is an estimate because the FAFSA doesn't come out until October, right? But we knew that for our market, that it's critically important for that to be in their hands as early as possible, so that they can start to see what it is, and that it isn't this school that has a $71,000 price tag and, oh my gosh, I have to rule it out. Or on the flip side, you know what, this might not still work for a family. And so maybe we need to round out our list a little bit more. And so it's something that we've been very intentional. It's very labor intensive, I will say, for our staff and for me and for the financial aid office. But we feel really strongly that it shouldn't be this throwing a dart at a dartboard and trying to figure out what in the world is going on. And so that's kind of how we've solved, or tried to help solve that problem.
And how many families do you have? Go ahead.
Oh, I was going to say, Cathy, thanks for making the distinction between private universities and smaller colleges. I should have been clear that it was just a handful of schools like yours that do this. There are a lot of state schools, as many of you know, that throw a lot of money around at out-of-state students, and they're often, although not always, and maybe not even the majority of the time, is some kind of grid or predictor for you. The University of Alabama is probably the best example. It's like, if you get this score and you get this grade, like, this is what you get, right? And many of you may remember your students scrambling for SAT seats, throwing themselves at the mercy of the coronavirus in the spring of 21. when the University of Alabama refused until like April 29th to lift the requirement that people have to take the test in order to get a shot at merit aid. So anyway, thanks for making that distinction.
So how many families do you have take you up on that?
We have just about 1,000 students that will submit either or both parts of that. And for a small school that ends up with domestically, because we only allow it for domestic students, because international is a different kind of a different level, right? But that equates to about a fourth of our overall application.
Wow. That's significant. I can see where that is a huge investment in time and resources to take that close look. And you bring up a really good point. And Ron, I'm sure you found this as you did your research too, that this is not a one size fits all. It's not a cookie cutter approach. And finding the it's more than just test scores, as you said. It's more than 2 items. What are the other things that come into play in this? And this is a question like, Ron, what have you found that families feel like is factors that should come into this?
Well, I'd be more interested in hearing Cathy's answer to that question. From like a more not cynical, but like aggressively sort of revelatory point of view from my perspective, I try to tell parents that, like, you've got a real advantage if you're a full pay family or close to it, not just because you may have an admissions edge, but there's like a psychological head game that's going on that you don't want to be a part of it, right? But the reason why a lot of schools haven't just like cut the tuition by $18,000 is because they know it feels good to be awarded a scholarship with a name on it. Like, academic studies have been shown that like a scholarship with a name is better than a scholarship that doesn't have a name, right? And so the object of the game, and I'm not speaking for Wooster here, but the object of the game for many schools is that, all right, well, if you know that most people who have the ability to pay your list price probably aren't going to, or would rather not, right? If you can discount, if you need $30,000 a year to times X number of students to keep the lights on, you need that average to not lose money on the deal. If you can discount from 60 to 43, that's still profitable. But a whole bunch of families out there will feel like they've saved $68,000, right? That feels really great, right? And the school, knowing that, may go chasing the high income, suburban zip codes in the greater Denver area, because for whatever reason, like we at Lawrence University or at Grinnell or Trinity in San Antonio, right, we're not getting our fair share of Colorado people. So we're gonna blast those zip codes and the kids who have decent PSAT scores in there with all sorts of A/B testing of postcards with verbiage, and if we can get like 8 more like that, we can have extra incremental income that's enough to have 6 more kids on a full ride, right? I mean, it's math, right? But then there are also the institutional needs, just from like having a sort of balanced class of kids who can do a lot of things, and there's a lot of unpredictability there, which I'd be curious to hear Cathy talk about.
Okay, Cathy.
I think that, Ron is right that it's a tricky market, and depending on where you fit in that marketplace, there's a lot of things that you have to account for. One of the things, and this isn't necessarily Wooster's, I'm not saying this specifically for Wooster, but in terms of that marketplace, some, especially on the East Coast, Moran, I'll pick on you a little bit, might look at a school and say, well, this one costs $78,000 and this one costs only $50,000. it's kind of like getting something from, Nordstrom's versus Kohl's, maybe, does the pricing, does that differential mean that there's a difference in the value of the product? I would argue no, right? That's not what it's about. But there is some of that in play too. And so it is there's an undercurrent of that it's not just about educating somebody on just who you are, but the value of who you are. And Ron is right. Students do every parent likes their students to get a merit scholarship or feel like they've been recognized for it. There's also a big, I'm hearing more and more from counselors, and I'm sure some of the counselors on the call might see this too. That families, there's a big difference between a want and a need, right? What they want to pay and what they can pay. And more families that have the ability to pay often are saying, well, let me see what that return on the investment really looks like. How do I know that I want to put this all in? Or on paper, it looks like I can pay this, but really I can't. And so there's some of that as well when we're looking at merit scholarships for someone that has an expected family contribution of $50,000. Can they really pay that $50,000? What does that mean? Where are they coming from? And so with a merit scholarship, does that help them financially, but also then make Wooster a truly viable financial option for that family? So I think I strayed a little bit from your question, but hopefully that helps.
Yeah, no, it does. And I think that's one of the things that we as counselors are really trying to communicate. I know, Ron, going back to your original story, actually, when I started doing financial aid consulting in the very beginning based on my own experience from financial aid too. And I was in a position when I was in college that somehow the financial aid process changed. And I went from qualifying for need to not qualifying for need. And I was faced with dropping out of college. And it scared me to death because I was worried I wouldn't get back in. And then through a series of things, I discovered, there's a process here. And so that process really made things work. And so I found, I work with a lot of families, like many of us, in the middle, where they can probably pay the full amount for a public school, although that's getting a little harder. But if they knew that they could apply to a private school or an out-of-state school like Wooster or Lawrence or some of the ones we've mentioned, that I'm going to spend $30,000 no matter what, I can spend 30 at Wooster or 30 at Cal State, Northridge. It's, so I'm still spending the same amount of money, but maybe my child will get better experience in opportunities and things like that. Otherwise, I wouldn't have even known that, because we look at it from a consumer perspective. And, the comparison you have, if I'm going to buy a Lexus, and I can only afford a Toyota, I'm not even going to look at the other. And financial aid in college, especially merit scholarships over the last few years, is not in a consumer perspective. So trying to translate from consumerese to collegese sometimes is difficult. So what do you tell families? Let me rephrase this. What do you tell counselors? What would you like us to know and be able to tell our families that we work with? So Cathy, I'll ask you that question first, and then Ron, I'll have you answer that. So what should we be telling our students and our families?
Yeah, well, I think that if you're looking at it from an investment standpoint, one, I'm going to plug Ron's book here, but I think you go back and read Ron's book and look at what are those factors that really are important for a student. What are they going to take away? What's that investment going to do for that student? 5-10 years out down the road, are they learning while they're there? Are they getting mentored? Are they making connections that have longer latitude than just the name on the diploma? So that's one thing. The other thing I'll just quickly say, and we talked about this, which is why I'm just going to quickly bring it up, but really look for those schools who are willing to be transparent. If they're willing to be transparent on both what they're doing in their admissions office, but also their financial aid office, that's usually going to speak to a school who really has the right intention of your students in their hands. But Ron, what would you say?
Yeah, I would. I would echo, of course, what you said about transparency. And I would also, I don't want to go too far over the line here, but I would also consider what the opposite of transparency looks like, not just in the financial aid and merit aid predictability realm, but the sorts of schools that might admit you and then toss you overseas for a year and give you no choice, or demands that you come out of the regular pool into the ED pool, or toss you across the country to go to school some other place for 12 months. I'm sure none of us know which school I'm talking about, or the fact that I might have written about them repeatedly in the last 3 months. They're not the only one that plays these games. The other thing I would mention is, and this is a hard thing to do when you're trying to get people to pay you, $2 or $5 or $10,000 over the course of a year or two, but be the person who forces the difficult questions, right? I mean, before you even start to think about fit and visit, right? Like, what did college mean to you, mom, dad, right? If you went to college, right? What were the mistakes that you made? What did you get right? Have you had a conversation with your child yet about your ability to pay and your willingness to pay, and whether there's a gap or a gulf, right, between those? If there's two parents in the household, what if you don't agree about the answers to those basic questions? And, if you have an ex, right, especially, right, if you had those conversations, because it has to sort of start there, right? And now you as the expert practitioner will want to kind of sift and sort those answers, because almost always the parent or the parents or the kid or all three of them will just be like dead wrong, right, about all the assumptions that they make. Most of them will have no earthly idea how the pricing and discounting system has changed, since the merit aid part kind of hived off and formed a parallel track. Right. And so, it has to start there with the education before the list making and visiting even starts. Now, I get that you don't always get people that early in the process. And, maybe you don't want to be the bad guy or the bad girl that's asking the pointed, uncomfortable, questions about money. Make me the bad guy. Right. Toss them some of my columns, or send them to the library for my book, or buy it for them, whatever, as, part of your fee package, and, make them answer the questions.
Yeah. Well, and I think that's really key. Sometimes we as counselors are afraid of bringing up the money, topic or subject, and like we're stepping across the line or something like that. I think we need to get comfortable with being able to do that, because the last thing we want to do is help a student go through this whole process. And then you get to this time of year and suddenly discover, no, I can't afford the college. You've got all these choices, and then you can't, the answer is no. And so having those conversations early on with our families and building a comfortableness with them, because if we can open up the conversation, then it makes it a little more comfortable for the families to open those conversations as well. So I've seen that very much. So any other, we've got some questions, so we're going to
go really good ones.
Some questions. And before we do that, Cathy, I want you to just talk a little bit about it. We've been talking about Wooster, but Wooster is part of the colleges that change lives. So can you talk a little bit about that philosophy, what that means? Many of us as counselors are familiar with that, but I want you to address that. And then
I think sometimes the counselors that I talk to are the biggest fans, and we're trying to alert the rest of the world what college has changed lives are. But The College of Changed Lives is a nonprofit organization that's really trying to talk about the fit and the value of fit in this never ceasing marketed world to college applicants. And so there's 44 schools that are in part of this consortium. And if you've read that book, you can really see that each school has their own chapter in a book written by Lauren Pope originally and then by Hillary. And you can really get the nuanced differences, but it goes back to what we've been talking about here. What are things that are valuable? What is worth paying for? What are going to be those high touch points? But College of Changed Lives is an organization that's near and dear to my heart. I used to be on the board of that organization. And it's there, you will find those schools to be very transparent as well, and really trying to take students where they are and transform them into learners as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And I've been fortunate enough to even have had Christine Bowman from Southwestern. I mean, she's even pulled up Slate and, showed people like, here's what this looks like and how we look at students and demonstrated interest, things like that. So let's go to a few more minutes, go to some of our questions. So Chris, who is in Boulder, I've noticed the conversation going on. Once a merit aid award has been made, is there any room for negotiation? And this is a great topic. And example, Harvey Mudd gives 30% of students an average of $15K in merit aid when my student getting anything. So what about negotiating on awards and kind of the right approach and the wrong approach for that? And Ron, I'm sure you have some things to say about that too.
I would just say, don't use the N word, and I would I will just as much as I encourage appeals, and I think maybe even the majority, possibly the vast majority of people should appeal, I also want to stand up for the honor of people like Cathy and others who do that work. If you haven't already, there was a fantastic story in the Chronicle of Higher Education 5 or 6 years ago. I think it was by Eric Hoover, who's one of the best higher ed journalists in the business. And the headline was something to the effect of why the vice president of enrollment management is the crappiest job in America. It was basically like, these folks are on the hot seat each year. They're trying to make their class. April is intense. And they've got all these people coming at them, wanting stuff, right? Don't be a jerk, right? Cathy is not a used car salesperson. She didn't create this system. She has to operate within it. I said this in the book, I have no idea what Cathy makes because she's not at a public institution, but there's a pretty good chance that if you have a 6-figure income and you're dealing with somebody in the middle of the country, your household makes more than the household of the person to whom you're filing the appeal, right? So behave yourself. Behave yourself. Appeal aggressively, make the best case you possibly can, but don't take up a lot of these people's time, and don't be a jerk.
Yeah, don't do it out of a sense of entitlement. My child is the perfect child and therefore is entitled to way more money than you've given them, type of thing. Yeah, I agree. I love that. So what do you...
Cathy, do you have any do's and don'ts?
Yeah.
So, but I want to make a point to be clear. This is not a financial aid appeal, right? This is strictly merit-based. Financial aid appeals go to the financial aid office. And so what we're talking about is those merit appeals. It's a delicate subject, right? Because what we're talking about is really trying to make Wooster affordable for those families who otherwise might just be slightly out of reach. These appeals, on most cases, whether it's at Wooster or another school, they're not usually huge swings, right? And so I think you have to approach it from that mindset. Is it a need or is it a want? And what is that need that need's going to go a lot further. I think also if you look at schools, some schools have, like Ron talked about in his book, have a model of that is part of their process. That is not the process at every school, that they just account for a bigger percentage to appeal. At Wooster, that is a pretty small percentage of our students that do this. And the most of the times, the one that those families that end up with a positive review, as you would say, is not a negotiation between the two, but it's really a conversation about where are you going next? How is this going to be? How's this going to work? And so those are the reviews that go further than the ones like you mentioned a minute ago, Cyndy, that come in kind of demanding, or your word that I'm not supposed to say loud, Ron, negotiating, right? And so I think that would be my tip, is to also know your market and your school and what they've tried to put up front. We don't have $1 billion endowment. We can't just hand out huge reviews. We try and put as much thought and process into the merit money we distribute up front, so that we don't have to do it on the back end. So yeah.
I think that's something important for us to know and understand as counselors. And again, also hearing it from you, and then we can then send that information and that message back to families too. So I think that's very valuable. So Sylvia's asking, Cathy, does a pre-read application get tagged as demonstrated interest? Does that help, show, okay, yeah, they might be more interested?
Absolutely. Yeah, it's a huge, they're taking time to do a mini application, and their family is also invested in it too. So it's a win-win for both us and for the family in that sense. Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. So Cathy's asking, if schools use a merit aid formula, how much latitude? And I think you've sort of answered that. Do you have some? I know some colleges will have, again, there's a rubric, and there's, if you've asked for an appeal, then that shows demonstrated interest as well. And then there are rubrics that say, oh, well, if we give them $500 or $1,000, then they might enroll. So what kind of latitude? Does it vary by college? What would your impression be?
Sorry, what's the...
Like, is there, when you're in the question is if schools use a merit aid formula, how much latitude do they really have?
In terms of a review then, or?
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
So and this is what Ron was talking about in one of the chapters in his book too, is that it can vary widely. At schools, where they're trying to be upfront, this is what I was trying to get at, there's not going to be a lot of variation in what that is, unless we assess in that conversation that there really is more need than maybe we initially interpreted. Again, that EFC, or that expected family contribution, is, can be widely, it can be a whole host of meanings for that family, right? And it can be an accurate representation, or it cannot be. And so I think there's some latitude for when that comes into play, where that EFC is really not as accurate for those higher EFC families than it might be.
Mm-hmm.
And Cathy, something that I don't think goes on at Wooster, but I am 99% sure goes on at Northeastern and places like it. It's an interesting story of how I learned this at Northeastern, and then how they disavowed it later in a way that I didn't think was, well, I've said too much already. But there are many schools that use an algorithm, that use software for the first pass, right? It sucks in all the data. Human beings make the, admit, deny decision. The algorithm spits out a kind of first offer and of a discount, and maybe that's reviewed or maybe it isn't. And it goes out with the understanding that there are going to be appeals, or that before the offer goes out, a human's going to look quickly over the algorithm's shoulder. So there is a formula, but there's also leeway built in. Cathy, does that sound familiar to you, that way of going at it?
It does. That's not
Yeah.
how we do it here, but
Yeah.
and that's not how most of the schools that I just mentioned a minute ago in the College to Change Lives do it either. We still read holistically. Most of us are still assigning a merit scholarship based on that review, and not just an algorithm from an outside company that's helping uh, to look at net tuition revenue and those kind of things.
Yeah. Hey, Cyndy, can I grab a question from way up the thread? Because
Please.
I'm really super curious to hear what Cathy will say about it.
Okay.
Which is, so Cathy, a really good application comes in from a student in a highly desirable geography. And your colleagues across the hall see the CSS profile, and there's a bunch of goose eggs in the 529 box, but the family has a household income of $212,000. Are you feeling resentful? Are they feeling resentful at that moment? That the family has no savings.
Yeah, so that's an interesting one for me, both personally and then putting on an executive director hat, right? It also goes back to how that EFC is calculated, because sometimes they've just gotten into an income bracket in the last 5 years where they haven't been able to save as aggressively as maybe somebody else would have, or they had their own student loan debt. So, I mean, there are some ways to explain a family not having saved at all. But for someone who looks so, my daily life is looking at the college, our product, our investment, and talking to families about an investment. I'm also a Midwesterner at heart. It's hard for me to not understand why families aren't saving and wanting that to be something that they're contributing to. But we don't always, going back to the first part of your question, I'm not seeing that data when I'm looking to admit that student. Those conversations happen later when we're trying to assess maybe sometimes the real need level and what's happening. But it is a complicated thing. You can't just set first swipe, but it is a curious thing as to why families aren't saving and what priorities they're making, and then what they want and maybe don't need in terms of what they're asking from a school. Is that what you're kind of getting at, Ron?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's a real conundrum, right? Because it's like, 1 year of data, particularly, I mean, there's advantages to it being 2 years old. I get that. But, a 1 year of data, particularly that year, right? 2020. I mean, good luck to anybody who's trying to use that to figure out anything, let alone intent or good faith. We're all our own individual histories of how we were raised, what if anything we inherited, when and how many times we were discriminated against, what things that happened to us that financially that were not our fault, what happened to us that was our fault, how much blame and punishment we deserve for that in the process, right? And then there's this whole, notion out there, and I don't think that's where this question comes from, because the people in the chat know better, right? But it's like this whole, people think they should have it coming, right? The need-based aid, they think they should have it coming because the list price is so expensive. And they've spent all this money to get into the good school district and on the enrichment that put the kid in the spot to have a shot to get it in the first place, right? And I have more than a little sympathy for those folks. I mean, they're literally my bread and butter reader. And I sometimes have a hard time sort of explaining to them why it might not work the way that they think it does. And in fact, that they're not, entitled to a discount that size just because. And, they persuade themselves that the family down the road in the bigger house, like, got a full ride, right? Without even knowing what the hell that means. And it's, as you all know, right? These things can be impossible to explain, often because they're, the stories aren't true in the first place.
Right. Right.
I also think it's interesting when families are willing to make that investment in a high school, but don't seem to be willing to make that investment in a college, which was the goal, I think, of putting them there to get them into college. But there's not always, but there's that handful of students every year, or those families every year. So, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. It's interesting because, and I tell people this all the time, we're entitled to free and public education, K through 12. That ends once your child graduates from high school. Then it's our responsibility as parents to send our kids to college. And most people don't realize that they think it just continues on. So, well, we are definitely at the top of the hour. There was one question that came through. I know it's not a quick answer, but I'm just going to throw it out there. Maybe, we'll talk about this in the future because we really don't have a definitive answer on this yet, but it's the changes in the EFC, and especially having the big change that we as counselors are very concerned about is multiple children in college, and that's no longer going to be a factor in that. So, I don't know if there's an update on that. I know there's some legislative, amendments that are being proposed and things like that. So if either one of you has any updates on that, that could be a topic for future.
I know what happened behind the scenes in the room on the Hill. But I'm much more interested in hearing from Cathy what the heck she's going to do if this stands.
Yeah, we did a admitted student program the other night, and our financial aid director was up there, and this very question came up, and she was like, yes, I understand your concern. Yes, I understand that it might look very different in 3 years, and what will that mean for your family? But I don't have an answer right now. They're not getting, our financial aid directors aren't getting a lot of information. So she was like, go out and talk to your congressperson, go out and talk to your senator and write in, get some lobbying done, right? But it will be an interesting conversation to see if that still stands when the student aid index comes into play versus the EFC.
Yeah. So that just, 15 seconds on what actually did happen. It was just, there was way more sympathy behind the scenes for people with lower incomes than people with higher incomes. And I think there was an understanding, or at least a hope, that, the Cathy Finkses of the world were just going to keep doing things the same way they always have, because they have latitude via the profile and their own institutional money to keep, discounting the same way that they always have. But there are, some private schools and universities that are EFC only and are not profile schools. And, and they're not going to have as much latitude if this sticks. And I think it's probably going to.
Yeah. And it might push more of those colleges to the profile for that exact reason. Mm-hmm. And I know I had asked the question of somebody on the post-secondary education committee at the, federal government level. And the answer they gave me was, well, we felt like by changing to the student aid index, we accommodated enough that we no longer needed to have the multiple student discount.
So then you have an access issue with the CSS profile too, right? You're creating more barriers, not just the FAFSA, but a CSS profile to get financial aid for families. And it seems like something that we should fix, but.
Yeah, well, that's a whole nother topic that we can spend a whole nother hour on. So we're going to close it now. Cathy, thank you so much. Ron, thank you. I know your time is very valuable. We're very honored to have you. And thank you. We had over 114 people on the call today. So thank you to each of you, and appreciate having you all. This will be available. And, I hope you've all been edified today. And, thank you again. Having these frank conversations is what my Friday forums are all about. So thank you. And we'll see you guys again.
Thanks,
I'll be back in
Thanks,
2
y'all.
weeks.
Kathy, good luck in the next 12 days.
Thank you.
No kidding. Leanne, thank you very much for holding down the fort.
Thanks, Leanne.
All right. Talk to you soon. Bye-bye.